line. Each village, however small, usually contains a leader, one among themselves whom they venerate, whose advice they seek in difficulty, and whose good opinion they chiefly value. I was immediately drawn to make this observation by occurrences that presented themselves to my personal experience. In the village of Little Marlow, an old woman ruled the community. She had lived for some years in an almshouse, and on fine Sundays her threshold was constantly beset by a crowd, seeking her advice and listening to her admonitions. She had been a soldier's wife, and had seen the world. Infirmity, induced by fevers caught in unwholesome quarters, had come on her before its time, and she seldom moved from her little cot. The plague entered the village, and while fright and grief deprived the inhabitants of the little wisdom they possessed, old Martha stepped forward and said, "Before now, I've been in a town where there was the plague." "And you escaped?" "No, but I recovered." After this, Martha was seated more firmly than ever on the regal seat, elevated by reverence and love. She entered the cottages of the sick. She relieved their wants with her own hand. She betrayed no fear, and inspired all who saw her with some portion of her own native courage. She attended the markets. She insisted upon being supplied with food for those who were too poor to purchase it. She shewed them how the well-being of each included the prosperity of all. She would not permit the gardens to be neglected, nor the very flowers in the cottage lattices to droop from want of care. Hope, she said, was better than a doctor's prescription, and everything that could sustain and enliven the spirits of more worth than drugs and mixtures. It was the sight of Little Marlow, and my conversations with Martha, that led me to the plan I formed. I had before visited the manor houses and gentlemen's seats, and often found the inhabitants actuated by the purest benevolence, ready to lend their utmost aid for the welfare of their tenants. But this was not enough. The intimate sympathy generated by similar hopes and fears, similar experience and pursuits, was wanting here. The poor perceived that the rich possessed other means of preservation than those which could be partaken of by themselves. Seclusion, and, as far as circumstances permitted, freedom from care. They could not place reliance on them, but turned with tenfold dependence to the succour and advice of their equals. I resolved, therefore, to go from village to village, seeking out the rustic archon of the place, and by systematizing their exertions, and enlightening their views, increase both their power and their use among their fellow cottagers. Many changes also now occurred in these spontaneous regal elections. Depositions and abdications were frequent, while in the place of the old and prudent, the ardent youth would step forward, eager for action, regardless of danger. Often, too, the voice to which all listened was suddenly silenced, the helping hand cold, the sympathetic eye closed, and the villagers feared still more the death that had selected a choice victim, shivering in dust the heart that had beat for them, reducing to incommunicable annihilation the mind forever occupied with projects for their welfare. Whoever labours for man must often find ingratitude, watered by vice and folly, spring from the grain which he has sown. Death, which had in our younger days walked the earth like a thief that comes in the night, now rising from his subterranean vault, girt with power, with dark banner floating, came a conqueror. Many saw, seated above his vice-regal throne, a supreme providence, who directed his shafts and guided his progress, and they bowed their heads in resignation, or at least in obedience. Others perceived only a passing casualty. They endeavoured to exchange terror for heedlessness, and plunged into licentiousness to avoid the agonizing throes of worst apprehension. Thus, while the wise, the good, and the prudent were occupied by the labours of benevolence, the truce of winter produced other effects among the young, the thoughtless, and the vicious. During the colder months, there was a general rush to London in search of amusement. The ties of public opinion were loosened. Many were rich, heretofore poor. Many had lost father and mother, the guardians of their morals, their mentors and restraints. It would have been useless to have opposed these impulses by barriers, which would only have driven those actuated by them to more pernicious indulgencies. The theatres were open and thronged, dance and midnight festival were frequented. In many of these decorum was violated, and the evils which hitherto adhered to an advanced state of civilization were doubled. The student left his books, the artist his study, the occupations of life were gone, but the amusements remained. Enjoyment might be protracted to the verge of the grave. All factitious colouring disappeared. Death rose like night, and protected by its murky shadows, the blush of modesty, the reserve of pride, the decorum of prudery were frequently thrown aside as useless veils. This was not universal. Among better natures, anguish and dread, the fear of eternal separation, and the awful wonder produced by unprecedented calamity, drew closer the ties of kindred and friendship. Philosophers opposed their principles as barriers to the inundation of profligacy or despair, and the only ramparts to protect the invaded territory of human life. The religious, hoping now for their reward, clung fast to their creeds, as the rafts and planks which over the tempest-vexed sea of suffering would bear them in safety to the harbour of the unknown continent. The loving heart, obliged to contract its view, bestowed its overflow of affection in triple portion on the few that remained. Yet even among these, the present, as an unalienable possession, became all of time to which they dared commit the precious freight of their hopes. The experience of immemorial time had taught us formerly to count our enjoyments by years, and extend our prospect of life through a lengthened period of progression and decay. The long road threaded a vast labyrinth, and the valley of the shadow of death in which it terminated was hid by intervening objects. But an earthquake had changed the scene. Under our very feet the earth yawned deep and precipitous, the gulf below opened to receive us, while the hours charioted us toward the chasm. But it was winter now, and months must elapse before we are hurled from our security. We became ephemera, to whom the interval between the rising and setting sun was as a long-drawn year of common time. We should never see our children ripen into maturity, nor behold their downy cheeks roughened, their blithe hearts subdued by passion or care. But we had them now. They lived, and we lived. What more could we desire? With such schooling did my poor Idris try to hush thronging fears, and in some measure succeeded. It was not as in summer-time, when each hour might bring the dreaded fate. Until summer we felt sure, and this certainty, short-lived as it must be, yet for a while satisfied her maternal tenderness. I know not how to express or communicate the sense of concentrated, intense, though evanescent transport, that imparadised us in the present hour. Our joys were dearer because we saw their end. They were keener because we felt to its fullest extent their value. They were purer because their essence was sympathy. As a meteor is brighter than a star, did the felicity of this winter contain in itself the extracted delights of a long, long life. How lovely is spring! As we looked from Windsor Terrace on the 16 fertile counties spread beneath, speckled by happy cottages and wealthier towns, all looked as in former years, heart-cheering and fair. The land was ploughed, the slender blades of wheat broke through the dark soil, the fruit trees were covered with buds, the husbandman was abroad in the fields, the milkmaid tripped home with well-filled pails, the swallows and martins struck the sunny pools with their long pointed wings. The new-dropped lambs reposed on the young grass. The tender growth of leaves lifts its sweet head into the air and feeds a silent space with ever-sprouting green. Man himself seemed to regenerate, and feel the frost of winter yield to an elastic and warm renewal of life. Reason told us that care and sorrow would grow with the opening year, but how to believe that ominous voice breathed up with pestiferous vapours from fear's dim cavern, while nature, laughing and scattering from her green lap flowers, and fruits and sparkling waters, invited us to join the gay mask of young life she led upon the scene? Where was the plague? Here, everywhere, one voice of horror and dismay exclaimed, when in the pleasant days of a sunny May the destroyer of man brooded again over the earth, forcing the spirit to leave its organic chrysalis, and to enter upon an untried life. With one mighty sweep of its potent weapon, all caution, all care, all prudence were levelled low. Death sat at the tables of the great, stretched itself on the cottager's pallet, seized the dastard who fled, quelled the brave man who resisted. Despondency entered every heart, sorrow dimmed every eye. Sights of woe now became familiar to me, and were I to tell all of anguish and pain that I witnessed, of the despairing moans of age, and the more terrible smiles of infancy in the bosom of horror, My reader, his limbs